information that's still being deciphered, because when people were experimenting with different plants and stuff and using historical text, and they weren't able to do that publicly in any way. In theory, the church would kill people for doing these things. So they did it under the guise of science. They were trying to turn people from, turn lead into gold, which is really an allegory for turning the leaden mind of an average man into the golden mind of an enlightened being. And so the green lion was the symbol for the cannabis plant and bang and the spirit that would overtake one and transmit knowledge. And there's all sorts of things that are going on that obviously I have no clue about, and I'm just trying, when I read alchemic text, to understand some parts of drugs and what they're doing. But certainly these plants and the practices around them continue despite Prohibition, which has been horrific at times, and the culture has lived on, and at times thrived despite that. Now, this was the tangent I wanted to go on. Okay, so I'm speeding up, and we're gonna start now early 1800s, and man, I haven't read this stuff in a while. There's sailboats going around, they get around to India. Well, India and Pakistan have had opium being used traditionally more among the sick and the elderly, and not done as a recreational drug for the most part, for a very long time. Who knows how long? But anyway, the Himalayan mountains kept this particular plant drug from getting all the way around to China. So for the 1800s, they'd not heard of it. Until the British showed up, they're like, hey, we got something for you guys to try. In fact, I think part of it was the British had some experience already with their own people using opium, and would have preferred to send it to China than to bring it home, right? So what they ended up doing was building this pretty large and really quickly clientele within China. And so because it was new to them in a lot of ways, they just kind of jumped onto it. And China's always had just kind of too many people and not enough good stuff to do in some ways. So they quickly turned to using it. So the British were like, oh, this is great. So what do? They start shipping as much opium to China as they can, and taking silver for it. The Emperor of China and the Chinese economy had built up on the trade of silver. It would be collected in taxes, and then it would go to the emperor, who would essentially pay the army and military and other people in the government in all the cities and towns, and it would filter out back into the economy through that way, and taxes would get back to the main government. Well, British screwed that up big time, and all the silver essentially left the country almost because of the amount of opium that was being bought, and the boats would be filled full of tea. All the tea in China comes from the fact that they didn't want these just mostly empty boats with a little bit of silver left in it, because what they do, they'd send like almost an empty boat with a little bit of money from Britain, and if it made it to India, they'd fill it full of opium as much as they could, and then they get it around to China, and then they get like this big whack of silver, and they just fill the rest up with tea. And then if they got all the way home, it was like the mother lode, and they'd sell the tea for a little bit, but it was obviously the silver and making silverware that they were really interested in. And so the emperor ended up going broke, and at the same time, a bunch of people realized that there's this economy and this plant that they could grow themselves. So what we have come to term as provincial warlords started to set up their own militaries, where they paid their military in opium. They kept people living in these communities, growing them opium and not allowing them to leave freely, and they were using their own militaries to not only control other economies but also rebel against the emperor, to the point where the emperor just lost it. That's one of the main reasons why the emperor was not able to keep paying for his army, and otherwise got taken over. And so all sorts of other funny things happened, and I'm going to mess the history up, which is kind of embarrassing. But I haven't read up on this. But one of the other things that started to happen that affected this policy was the Japanese were trying to take over China, and they thought the best way to do it was just keep them high on opium. So you ended up with all these Japanese opium dealers in the north of China that were, really just essentially, at times literally trying to tell the Chinese people, if you let us govern your territory, we'll make sure you've got all the good opium you need, and that's all you got to worry about, right? That was literally their policies at times. And so at certain points, the Chinese weren't really even too concerned about whether it was the emperor or the Japanese that were in charge or whatever. And so then on the other hand, you had these British people. Oh yeah, I forgot about the wars. How could I forget about that? Jesus. Anyway, back in before it all fell apart, the emperor tried to stop them from selling opium. And the British wouldn't agree to that. They actually fought 2 wars that the British won in the end in some ways because the Chinese emperor was trying to stop them from bringing opium into the country. In fact, Hong Kong was settled after the Second War so that the British would be able to bring their opium into the port, and then it would be transported from small boats from the harbor into the piers and through Hong Kong into the rest of China. That was the main purpose of establishing that as being a separate entity for so long from the rest of the Chinese mainland. And so in a lot of ways, drug policy and drug trade has formed what we see as China. And then, oh God, there's too much to say. But there was a real change occur when the Communist Party took hold of that country. They just came on this totally militant bent and essentially following the American lead of prohibitionists, because the British were all about like taxes and control, regulatory stuff, right? Even to this day, there's a little difference. The British have got harm reduction programs, heroin maintenance stuff going on, and the Americans are throwing everybody in jail that even thinks of that idea. So, the Americans came in with their prohibitionist attitude and, convinced in some ways, although the Chinese Communist Party certainly had their own reasons to just want to come out and just stop everybody from using opium. And, they resorted to their, most convenient tactic of death, which is just bizarre. But anyway, so China's gone from, one extreme in some ways to another. The history of prohibition is huge. I hope next year to go on a tangent about the prohibition of cannabis and drugs in Islam, partly because I don't know a damn thing about it, but they don't really embrace it in the same way that I think they have historically. So I'm going to learn more about that myself. I talked about the history of prohibition of cannabis and the Marijuana Tax Act and that extensively. Some people don't know it, but Elvis Presley actually received a special badge for the Drug Enforcement Agency at the same time as experimenting and drinking and doing all sorts of funny stuff. So, he basically showed up unannounced at the White House to meet with the president and get himself one of these special badges so that they couldn't bug him for drugs at the airports anymore. He was the king. And then there's Nancy. Sorry to depress you. And we all know too well how many people have gone into jail and been incarcerated. And despite the Americans starting to realize that prohibition is the wrong policy to go in, unfortunately, the Canadian government's going the opposite direction. We were within a hair of having mandatory minimums for people growing pot put in actually this month, except Harper's manic power hunger as threw that off, but it may come back into effect again. And I guess it will be a great day when we truly talk about the history of prohibition as a historical fact, but it is going on right now. Anyway, next week, economics of cannabis. So, I don't know what I'm talking about yet. We'll take it from there. Thanks everybody for coming out. Have a great day and smoke it.